She thought he was just another difficult passenger. But when a frustrated flight attendant's impulsive slap turns into a viral scandal, the shocking truth about the elderly man's identity leaves everyone stunned. You won't believe who he really is and what happens next. Watch the full story, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable twists like this. The airport was alive with the usual chaos of a busy travel day, echoes of flight announcements blending with the hum of rolling suitcases and the chatter of restless passengers. Among the bustling crowd, Sandra marched toward Gate 27 with an air of hurried authority. Her navy blue uniform was crisp, but her expression betrayed the strain of a long week. As a senior flight attendant juggling an understaffed team, a delayed flight, and the constant demand for professionalism, she barely noticed the sidelong glances of passengers waiting in line. Her focus was survival, another flight, another paycheck, and then, hopefully, a day off to catch her breath. She adjusted her scarf with a sharp tug as she approached the counter, where a young trainee fumbled with boarding passes. Sandra bit back the urge to reprimand her in front of the passengers. Instead, she muttered through gritted teeth, "Pick up the pace, Molly. We're already running late." Molly nodded nervously, her cheeks flushing as she dropped yet another pass. Sandra sighed, frustration simmering under her skin. From the corner of her eye, Sandra noticed an elderly black man standing a few feet away. He was dressed plainly in a beige sweater and slacks, with a leather briefcase resting at his feet. His face was lined with the kind of wear that spoke of years of experience rather than age alone. He held a ticket in his hand, his gaze calm but intent. Sandra dismissed him as just another passenger, one of many who would soon be shuffling onto the plane. "Excuse me," the man said softly, his voice barely cutting through the noise. Sandra turned to him, her tone clipped. "Sir, please wait in line. We'll call your group when it's time to board." "I understand," he replied, unbothered by her brusque tone. "I just wanted to ask if there's someone who can assist me with my seat. I have a bit of trouble getting around these days." Sandra's eyes flicked to the growing line of passengers, then back to him. Her patience was wearing thin. "You'll need to ask once you're on board," she said, already moving on to the next issue. The man gave a small nod, his expression unchanged, and stepped aside without another word. The pre-flight chaos didn't end there. A crying baby pierced the air as a young mother struggled with her stroller. A businessman barked complaints into his phone, and Molly dropped another stack of papers. Sandra felt her temper fraying like an overworked thread. She glanced back at the elderly man, now seated quietly near the gate, flipping through a book. Something about his composure irritated her. It felt almost pointed, like a silent critique of her spiraling frustration. As the boarding process began, Sandra's focus sharpened. She directed passengers with the efficiency of a drill sergeant, her voice firm and no nonsense. The elderly man was one of the last to board, his slow, deliberate movements holding up the line. When he finally reached the aircraft door, Sandra forced a smile. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone robotic. "Thank you," he replied, pausing to glance at her. His eyes lingered for just a moment, enough to unsettle her, though she couldn't say why. The cabin filled quickly, and Sandra moved through the aisles, ensuring everyone was settled. Her interactions with the passengers were brief and transactional. When she reached the elderly man's row, he was struggling to stow his briefcase in the overhead compartment. He looked up at her, a quiet request in his eyes. "Sir, I need you to be seated. We're about to begin taxiing," she said curtly. "I'm trying," he replied, his voice even. "This bag is a little heavy for me." Sandra sighed, exasperated. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed the briefcase and shoved it into the compartment, the sound of the latch snapping shut louder than she intended. The man nodded his thanks and eased into his seat, his movements deliberate and measured. Sandra turned on her heel, eager to move on, but something about his calm demeanor gnawed at her. It was as though he carried an invisible weight, heavier than the briefcase she'd just hoisted, and she couldn't help but feel it pressing down on her as well. The flight was already behind schedule when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. informing passengers of yet another delay. A collective groan filled the cabin, rippling through the rows like a wave of discontent. Sandra clenched her jaw and plastered on a smile as she moved through the aisles, pretending not to hear the grumbling passengers. Inside, her nerves felt like live wires, fraying with each passing minute. Near the back of the plane, the elderly man pressed the call button. Sandra glanced toward the illuminated light above his seat and muttered under her breath. She walked over, her shoes clicking against the narrow aisle, and stopped abruptly at his row. "Is there something I can assist you with, sir?" she asked, her voice straining to sound polite. The man looked up at her with calm, steady eyes. "I believe the seatbelt on my side is jammed," he said. He gestured to the strap, which indeed looked tangled beneath the armrest. "I've tried to fix it, but it seems stuck." Sandra exhaled sharply and crouched down to inspect the seatbelt. She tugged at it with unnecessary force, freeing it in one swift motion. "There. It's fine now," she said, straightening up. Her tone was sharper than she intended, but she didn't bother to soften it. "Anything else?" The man shook his head. "Thank you," he said simply, leaning back in his seat. Sandra turned to leave, but a woman seated across the aisle called out, her voice tinged with disapproval. "Excuse me," the woman said, "but there's no need to be so short with him. He's just asking for help." Sandra froze for a moment before turning to face the woman, her polite mask firmly back in place. "I'm doing my best to assist all passengers, ma'am," she said, her words clipped. "If there's anything else you need, let me know." The woman gave her a pointed look but said nothing further. Sandra walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, her cheeks burning. She could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her back, their silent judgments prickling at her skin. She hated this, hated the feeling of being scrutinized, of being painted as the bad guy. But more than that, she hated how easily the old man's quiet demeanor seemed to invite sympathy, while her own stress went unnoticed. Back in the galley, Sandra poured herself a cup of water, her hands trembling slightly. Molly appeared a moment later, her expression tentative. "You okay?" Molly asked, her voice soft. "I'm fine," Sandra replied curtly, taking a sip of the water. "Just a long day." Molly hesitated, then nodded, clearly unsure of what else to say. Sandra dismissed her with a wave and leaned against the counter, trying to steady her breathing. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to focus. It was just one flight, she reminded herself. Just a few more hours. But when she opened her eyes, she found herself glancing back toward the cabin, her gaze drawn to the elderly man's seat. He was reading his book again, his face serene as if nothing had happened. The sight of him stirred something unfamiliar in her chest, a flicker of unease, perhaps, or guilt. She shook it off quickly. There was no time for self-reflection, not when the demands of the job were piling up by the minute. As she turned back to the counter, the intercom buzzed again, and the captain announced they would finally be departing. Sandra sighed in relief and prepared herself for the next leg of the journey, determined to keep her emotions in check. But the feeling of disquiet lingered, a subtle but persistent thread that refused to unravel. As the plane finally lifted off, the cabin settled into a tentative calm. The low hum of the engines blended with the occasional rustle of newspapers, murmured conversations, and the soft clicks of fingers typing on keyboards. Sandra moved down the aisle with her cart, handing out drinks and snacks with mechanical efficiency. She avoided making eye contact, focusing instead on keeping the line moving. When she reached the elderly man's row, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice void of the warmth she mustered for other passengers. "Water, please," he replied, not looking up from his book. Sandra poured the water and handed it to him. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and she noticed how steady they were, how deliberate his movements seemed, even in something as simple as taking a cup. He murmured a quiet thank you, and she nodded briskly before moving on, dismissing the moment almost as soon as it happened. Further down the aisle, a teenage boy in a hoodie, earbuds dangling from his ears, caught her attention. His phone was tilted upward, its camera lens aimed at her. She narrowed her eyes, annoyed. "Excuse me, young man," she said sharply. "Is there a reason you're recording me?" The boy blinked, startled, and lowered his phone. "I wasn't recording you," he said defensively. "I was just, filming for my vlog." "Well, please don't include me in your vlog," Sandra snapped. "It's against airline policy." The boy muttered something under his breath and tucked his phone into his pocket, slouching lower in his seat. Sandra turned away, her nerves tingling with irritation. The sense of being watched, scrutinized, seemed to follow her like a shadow. She felt it again as she passed the elderly man's row, where the woman across the aisle was now glaring at her openly, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Sandra forced herself to focus on her work, but her frustration simmered beneath the surface. When she returned to the galley, Molly was there again, fumbling with a stack of trays. Sandra reached for one of them, her movements brisk. "Careful," she said, her tone harsher than she intended. "The last thing we need is more mess." Molly's face fell, and she mumbled an apology. Sandra sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I didn't mean it like that," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just let's stay on top of things." Molly nodded, but the tension lingered, an invisible barrier between them. Sandra hated how easily she snapped, how her patience seemed to evaporate at the slightest inconvenience. She hated even more how aware she was of it, as though every sharp word left a mark she couldn't erase. The flight dragged on, the hours marked by a steady rhythm of requests, complaints, and mundane tasks. Sandra threw herself into her work, determined to keep her mind occupied. But every so often she found her gaze drifting back to the elderly man. He remained a quiet presence, his focus unwavering as he turned the pages of his book. It was infuriating in a way, how little he seemed affected by the incident earlier. While she bristled with every sideways glance and hushed whisper, he sat there, calm and composed, as though he existed in an entirely different orbit. It made her feel small somehow, petty and reactive in a way she couldn't quite name. As the plane cruised over endless stretches of ocean, Sandra found herself replaying their brief interactions in her mind. The way he had thanked her, his voice steady but unassuming. The way he had looked at her earlier, his gaze probing but not unkind. It unsettled her, this sense that he saw more than she wanted to reveal, that he had drawn conclusions she wasn't ready to confront. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. This was just another flight, just another passenger. And yet, the unease lingered, growing heavier with each passing mile. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight entered its cruise phase, signaling a brief lull in activity. Passengers settled into their routines, some flicking through in-flight entertainment, others dozing off with neck pillows askew. Sandra used this time to reorganize the galley, her movements methodical but driven more by a need for distraction than necessity. The quiet hum of the engines should have been comforting, but instead, it amplified the thoughts buzzing in her mind. She hadn't expected to feel this off balance. Years of working in the air had taught her to compartmentalize, to handle difficult passengers and challenging situations without letting it show. And yet the events of the past hour seemed to stick to her like static. Her interactions with the elderly man replayed on a loop in her head, each moment tinged with a strange mixture of irritation and regret. Her thoughts were interrupted by a light knock on the galley wall. Molly stood there, her face a mix of hesitation and concern. "Sandra," she began cautiously, "that man in 23C, the older one, he asked for you." Sandra froze mid-motion, the tray of cups in her hands trembling slightly. "Asked for me?" she repeated, her tone sharper than intended. Molly nodded. "He pressed the call button and said he'd prefer if you came instead of me." A flicker of annoyance shot through Sandra, but it was quickly swallowed by unease. "Fine," she said curtly, setting down the tray with more force than necessary. She smoothed her uniform and made her way toward the cabin, her mind racing. Why did he specifically request her? Was this his way of drawing attention to their earlier exchange? A power move? As she approached row 23, her steps slowed. The elderly man looked up from his book as she neared, his expression calm but direct. His presence seemed to carry a quiet gravity that unsettled her more than any angry outburst could have. "Yes, sir," Sandra said, keeping her voice neutral. He gestured to the tray table in front of him. "I'm afraid it's a bit wobbly," he said. His tone was polite, almost apologetic. "I thought it might be best to let you know." Sandra stared at the tray table for a moment, her irritation threatening to bubble over. She reached down and gave it a cursory tug, confirming his observation. "It's loose, yes," she said. "I'll make a note of it for maintenance." "Thank you," he said simply. Then, as she turned to leave, he added, "I hope I'm not troubling you." The comment stopped her in her tracks. She glanced back at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "No trouble," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. He nodded, his gaze steady. "Good," he said. "It's just that you seem distracted, overburdened perhaps." Sandra stiffened, the words landing with unexpected weight. "I'm fine, sir," she said, forcing a tight smile. "Thank you for your concern." "I don't mean to pry," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But sometimes it helps to hear that someone notices." For a moment, Sandra didn't know how to respond. Her instinct was to dismiss him, to brush off his observation as misplaced or unnecessary. But something about his tone, the way it lacked judgment or pity, left her feeling exposed. She managed a stiff nod and quickly walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. Back in the galley, she leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge as though anchoring herself. Molly glanced over, her expression questioning, but Sandra shook her head, signaling she didn't want to talk. She replayed the man's words in her mind, their simplicity masking a depth that unsettled her. "You seem overburdened." Of course she was. Who wouldn't be in her position? But it wasn't just what he said. It was the way he said it, as if he truly saw her, stripped of the professional facade she worked so hard to maintain. Her thoughts spiraled further, touching on things she had buried long ago. The nights spent working double shifts to pay off mounting debts, the countless times she'd been overlooked or dismissed by passengers who saw her as nothing more than a nameless server in the sky. She wasn't proud of the sharpness that had crept into her demeanor over the years, but it had felt necessary, a shield against the constant demands of a job that rarely offered gratitude in return. But now, standing in the dimly lit galley, she felt that shield begin to crack. It wasn't just the man's words, it was his presence, the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from him, forcing her to confront parts of herself she'd rather ignore. As she stood there, the intercom buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "we've been informed of some turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Sandra sighed and straightened her uniform. There was no time for reflection now. She pushed the feelings aside, burying them as deep as she could, and returned to the cabin to prepare for what came next. But even as she moved through the motions of her job, the unease lingered, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. The turbulence began as a faint shudder beneath their feet, a subtle vibration that could almost be mistaken for an overactive imagination. But soon, the shudder turned into a jolt, and the seatbelt signs above each row blinked to life with an audible ding. Passengers stirred uneasily, some gripping the armrests while others peered out of windows as though they might see the turbulence coming. Sandra tightened her grip on the galley counter as the plane swayed again, a larger dip this time. Her stomach lurched, but her face remained impassive. Experience told her that maintaining a calm demeanor was half the battle during moments like these. Passengers looked to the crew for reassurance, and any sign of unease could spark unnecessary panic. She moved briskly through the cabin, ensuring that overhead bins were latched and trays secured. Molly followed closely behind, her face pale but determined. Sandra caught the younger woman's nervous glance and gave a quick, curt nod. "Stay steady," she murmured. "We've been through worse." As Sandra reached row 23, her eyes were drawn, almost reflexively, to the elderly man. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the edges of the armrests. Unlike the passengers around him, who clutched at their seats or muttered anxiously to one another, his demeanor remained unshaken. His calmness irritated Sandra, though she couldn't say why. It was as if the turbulence couldn't touch him, as though he existed on a different plane of reality altogether. "Sir," she said, louder than she intended. He looked up at her, his expression neutral. "Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened." "It is," he replied evenly, his voice carrying no trace of fear or urgency. He tugged lightly at the strap across his lap to demonstrate. "I appreciate your concern." Sandra's lips pressed into a thin line. Something about the way he spoke, so measured, so composed, made her feel like a child being humored by a patient adult. "Good," she said shortly, then turned to continue down the aisle. But as she walked away, she could feel his gaze following her, steady and inscrutable. It made her skin prickle. The turbulence grew worse. The plane pitched sharply to the left, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. A baby began to wail, its cries cutting through the low hum of fear that filled the air. Sandra's training kicked in immediately. She doubled back toward the rows where a mother was struggling to console the child, her arms tightening protectively around the small, squirming body. "Ma'am," Sandra said, crouching beside the seat. Her voice was firm but gentle, the kind of tone she reserved for situations like this. "I know it's scary, but the baby can feel your tension. Just take a deep breath and hold on tight. We're trained for this." The mother nodded, her eyes wide with fear but grateful for the reassurance. Sandra stood and made her way toward the galley again, her focus now on keeping the crew prepared for any escalation. When she reached the galley, Molly was bracing herself against the counter, her knuckles white. Sandra gave her a once-over and then clapped a hand on her shoulder. "Molly," she said, "you need to breathe. This isn't your first bout of turbulence." Molly nodded but didn't look up. It feels worse this time," she muttered. "It always feels worse in the moment," Sandra said briskly, "but the captain has it under control. Focus on what we can do, keeping the cabin safe." Her words were interrupted by a sharp, almost violent jolt. The lights flickered and a shriek rang out from somewhere near the middle of the cabin. Sandra's heart leapt into her throat, but she forced herself to stay grounded. She turned to Molly. "Stay here. I'll check." She moved quickly back into the cabin, steadying herself against the backs of seats as the plane rocked again. She spotted the source of the commotion. A middle-aged man had ignored the seatbelt sign and was now sprawled awkwardly across the aisle, one hand clutching his elbow. Sandra rushed to him, crouching low to avoid being thrown off balance by the turbulence. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp with urgency, "you need to get back to your seat immediately." I was trying to use the bathroom," the man stammered, his face pale. "I lost my balance." Sandra glanced around, her mind racing. The turbulence showed no signs of abating, and the man was too unsteady to make it back to his seat on his own. She gritted her teeth and extended a hand. "All right, let's get you up." Slowly. As she helped him to his feet, she felt the plane dip again, her knees buckling slightly under the strain. The man clung to her arm, his grip desperate. "I can't," he muttered. "I feel dizzy." "Keep your eyes on me," Sandra ordered. Her tone left no room for argument. She guided him back to his seat with quick, practiced movements, then pulled the seatbelt across his lap and clicked it into place. "Stay put," she said firmly. "If you need anything, press the call button." The man nodded weakly, his eyes fluttering shut. Sandra exhaled sharply, her pulse pounding. As she straightened up, she caught a glimpse of the elderly man in row 23. He was watching her again, his gaze unwavering. This time, however, there was a flicker of something in his expression, a shadow of approval, perhaps, or understanding. Sandra didn't have time to dwell on it. She returned to the galley just as the turbulence began to subside. The plane steadied, the frantic energy in the cabin giving way to a tentative quiet. Sandra leaned against the counter, her body heavy with the weight of adrenaline. Molly glanced at her, wide-eyed. Is it over?" "For now," Sandra said, her voice tight. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. But as the hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, her thoughts drifted back to the man in 23C. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite place. And it wasn't just his calmness during the turbulence, though that had been remarkable. It was the way he had looked at her, as though he saw through the mask she wore, straight into the core of who she was. The unease that had plagued her earlier returned, sharper now, and Sandra knew instinctively that her interaction with him was far from over. The turbulence passed, but the unease in the cabin lingered like an aftertaste. Passengers murmured to one another, their voices hushed yet urgent, as though speaking too loudly might invite the chaos to return. Sandra took advantage of the relative calm to check in on a few of the more visibly shaken passengers. The young mother she'd reassured earlier offered a weak smile as her baby finally drifted to sleep. Sandra nodded, acknowledging the momentary success, but her thoughts were elsewhere, fixated on the man in 23C. She didn't understand why he unsettled her so much. Maybe it was his composure, that quiet, almost otherworldly calm that seemed impervious to the stress surrounding him. Or maybe it was his words, still echoing in her mind. "You seem overburdened." Whatever it was, he had burrowed into her thoughts, and no amount of busy work could dislodge him. As she made her way back toward the galley, Sandra caught sight of him again. He was no longer reading. Instead, his hands rested loosely on the armrests, his eyes closed as though in meditation. His stillness stood in stark contrast to the subdued restlessness of the passengers around him. She wanted to ignore him, to chalk up her feelings to exhaustion and move on. But something about him drew her in, like a puzzle she couldn't help but solve. In the galley, Molly stood fiddling with the lids of drink containers, her nervous energy evident in the quick, jittery movements of her hands. Sandra stepped in, gently nudging the younger woman aside. "Why don't you take a break?" she suggested, softening her tone. "We've got things under control for now." Molly hesitated but eventually nodded, retreating toward the crew area with a grateful glance. Sandra sighed and turned her attention to organizing the trays and cups, letting the repetitive task occupy her hands while her mind wandered. It wasn't long before a soft chime sounded, signaling yet another call button. Sandra glanced at the illuminated light above row 23 and felt her stomach tighten. She took a steadying breath, adjusted her scarf, and walked down the aisle. The elderly man looked up as she approached, his expression as composed as ever. He gestured to the empty plastic cup on his tray table. "I was wondering if I might trouble you for some more water," he said, his tone polite but firm. Sandra nodded, her movements brisk as she retrieved the cup and replaced it with a fresh one. "Here you go, sir," she said, keeping her voice neutral. She was about to turn away when he spoke again. "Thank you," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "You handled the turbulence well. It's clear you've been doing this for a long time." Sandra froze, caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. "It's part of the job," she said after a brief pause. Her tone was dismissive, but there was a flicker of something else in her voice, something softer. "Part of the job, yes," he agreed. "But not everyone does it with your level of composure. I've seen a lot of flights, and I can tell when someone genuinely knows how to keep things together." She didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments weren't uncommon in her line of work, but this one felt different. It wasn't just polite gratitude, it was specific, deliberate, as though he'd been paying closer attention to her than she realized. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quieter now. She started to turn away again, but his next words stopped her in her tracks. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said. "Someone who worked so hard to prove herself that she forgot to take care of herself in the process." Sandra turned back, her expression carefully neutral. "And did she figure it out?" she asked, her tone more guarded than curious. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more weight than words. "Eventually," he said, "but not before life reminded her the hard way." The cabin seemed to shrink around her, the hum of the engines fading into the background. Sandra felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat, though she couldn't say why. She didn't know this man, didn't know him any part of herself, and yet his words pierced through her defenses with startling precision. "I should get back to work," she said abruptly, her voice tight. She turned and walked away, her steps quick and purposeful, but her thoughts lagging behind. His words clung to her like an unwelcome passenger, refusing to let her move on. Back in the galley, she leaned against the counter, gripping its edge as though anchoring herself. Her mind churned with questions she didn't want to ask. Who was this man, and why did he seem to see through her so easily? More importantly, why did she feel like he was right? That she was overburdened, overworked, and dangerously close to unraveling. She shook her head, forcing the thoughts away. There was still half the flight ahead, and she couldn't afford to lose focus now. But deep down, she knew the encounter had left a mark, one she couldn't ignore no matter how hard she tried. The hours stretched on, the monotony of cruising altitude doing little to soothe Sandra's frayed nerves. Despite the relative calm in the cabin, her mind was a turbulent storm. The elderly man's words lingered, replaying in her head with an insistence that made it impossible to focus fully on her duties. She tried to lose herself in the motions of her work, collecting trash, answering passenger questions, and refilling drinks. Yet every time she glanced toward row 23, she felt a pull, an urge to study him as though she might uncover some hidden truth. His calm demeanor grated on her nerves, not because it was disruptive, but because it wasn't. He sat there, quietly reading or gazing out the window, a picture of tranquility amidst the restlessness of the cabin. It was maddening. As she passed his row again, the woman seated across the aisle, who had given Sandra pointed looks earlier, stopped her with a raised hand. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone laced with polite but unmistakable reproach. "Do you mind checking on him? He hasn't touched the food you served earlier, and I think he's been sitting there for hours without moving." Sandra bristled. The last thing she needed was another passenger acting as if she wasn't doing her job. "I've already attended to him several times, ma'am," she replied, her voice measured but firm. "He hasn't requested anything else." "Well," the woman persisted, leaning forward conspiratorially, "it's just that he seems off. Maybe he's not feeling well." Sandra forced a thin smile. "I'll check on him again just to be sure." She turned to the elderly man, who had clearly overheard the exchange. He looked up at her, his expression calm but with a glimmer of something she couldn't quite place. Amusement, perhaps, or mild exasperation. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" Sandra asked, her tone professional but edged with fatigue. "I'm perfectly fine," he said, his voice steady and clear. He glanced at the woman across the aisle, offering her a small, polite nod. "I appreciate the concern, though." The woman seemed satisfied with his response, but Sandra could feel her cheeks flush with annoyance. It wasn't the man who irritated her, at least not entirely. It was the way the other passengers seemed to view her as negligent, as though she wasn't already bending over backward to manage everyone's needs. "Let me know if there's anything else you need," Sandra said, her words clipped. She moved to leave, but his voice stopped her. "I would like to ask you something," he said, his tone quiet but firm enough to hold her attention. She turned back, wary. "What is it?" He folded his hands on his tray table, his gaze steady. "How long have you been doing this job?" The question caught her off guard. It wasn't unusual for passengers to make small talk, but this felt different, more pointed somehow. "A little over 10 years, she said cautiously. "Why do you ask?" He nodded thoughtfully, as though the answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "And do you enjoy it?" Sandra hesitated, the question striking a nerve. She had answered it before, of course, countless times to curious passengers, family members, and even herself. The response was always the same. "I love meeting new people. It's a rewarding job." But now, standing in front of this man, she found herself unable to say the words. "It has its moments," she said finally, her tone evasive. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "It doesn't sound like you do," he said, his voice soft but matter-of-fact. Her chest tightened, a flash of irritation rising to the surface. "With all due respect, sir, I don't see how that's any of your business." "Perhaps it isn't," he replied, unruffled by her tone. "But it's written all over your face. You're tired. More than tired, I think. And I can't help but wonder if you've forgotten why you started in the first place." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For a moment she stood frozen, staring at him as a flood of emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to argue, to tell him he had no right to make assumptions about her life, but deep down she knew he wasn't wrong. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain her composure. "I'm not sure what you're trying to say," she managed, her voice tight. "I'm not trying to say anything," he said simply. "I'm just asking you to think about it." Sandra turned abruptly, walking away before he could say anything else. Her hands trembled as she retreated to the galley, where Molly was unpacking trays of drinks. Molly glanced up, concern flickering across her face. "Sandra, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Sandra snapped more harshly than she intended. Molly flinched and guilt immediately clawed at her. Sandra exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice softer now. I need a moment." Molly nodded, stepping aside to give her space. Sandra leaned against the counter, her mind racing. She didn't know what unsettled her more, the man's words, or the fact that they felt like something she needed to hear. For years, she had pushed herself to the limit, convincing herself that her sacrifices were worth it, that she was building a career she could be proud of. But lately, that conviction had begun to waver, replaced by a gnawing emptiness she didn't want to acknowledge. And now, this stranger, this maddeningly perceptive stranger, had forced her to confront it. Sandra took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The flight wasn't over yet, and she couldn't afford to let her emotions take control. But as she glanced toward the cabin again, her eyes drawn involuntarily to row 23, she knew this wasn't the last time she'd be forced to face the questions he'd stirred in her. The flight wore on, the hours stretching thin as the cabin settled into a quiet hum. Most passengers were now either engrossed in their screens or drifting in and out of sleep, the occasional clink of a cup or muffled cough punctuating the stillness. Sandra remained in the galley, pacing like a caged animal, the elderly man's words echoing in her mind. She felt exposed, as though he had peeled back a layer of her carefully maintained professionalism and glimpsed something she'd hidden even from herself. She wanted to confront him, to challenge his audacity, but every time she thought about returning to row 23, she hesitated. What would she even say? That he didn't know her life, her struggles, her reasons for carrying herself the way she did? That his unsolicited observations were unwelcome? And yet, deep down, she knew his words weren't entirely wrong. The intercom buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, his voice steady but with an undertone of tension. "We've encountered an issue with one of our systems. While it's nothing to be alarmed about, we'll be descending slightly as a precaution. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further notice." The murmurs started almost immediately, spreading like ripples through the cabin. Sandra's chest tightened. She'd handled countless flights with minor mechanical issues, but the announcement came with a familiar weight, a reminder of how easily things could spiral out of control. She stepped into the aisle, scanning the rows for signs of unease. Passengers were already shifting in their seats, whispering to one another. Her training kicked in, and she moved quickly, offering calming words to those who looked particularly nervous. "Everything is under control," she told a man clutching his armrest, his knuckles white. "This is just a precaution." As she passed row 23, her eyes fell on the elderly man. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his face betraying no trace of concern. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Reassurance, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. He gave her the faintest nod, as if to say, "I trust you." It was a simple gesture, but it steadied her more than she expected. She nodded back and continued down the aisle, her steps more purposeful now. The descent began, and with it came a subtle but perceptible change in the cabin's atmosphere. The hum of the engines deepened, and the air pressure shifted, making ears pop. Sandra worked diligently to maintain a sense of normalcy, checking on passengers and ensuring everyone was secure. But the unease was palpable, a collective tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Back in the galley, Molly was gripping the edge of the counter, her face pale. "Do you think it's serious?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drone of the engines. Sandra shook her head, though she wasn't entirely sure. "The captain said it's precautionary," she replied, keeping her tone firm. "Our job is to stay calm and make sure the passengers do the same." Molly nodded, but her hand still trembled as she reached for a bottle of water. Sandra placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "We'll be fine," she said, and for a moment she almost believed it herself. The cabin lights flickered briefly, drawing a fresh wave of murmurs from the passengers. Sandra straightened and stepped back into the aisle, her presence a silent reassurance as she moved through the rows. She stopped again at row 23, her eyes involuntarily drawn to the elderly man. He wasn't reading anymore. Instead, he was gazing out the window, his expression contemplative. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. He turned to her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Everything is as it should be," he said simply. The cryptic response left her momentarily at a loss. She studied him, searching for any hint of fear or unease, but found none. Instead, his calmness seemed to radiate outward, cutting through the tension like a balm. "Do you travel often?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "Quite often," he replied, his tone conversational. "But it's not the flights I notice, it's the people." Sandra frowned slightly. "The people?" He nodded. "Everyone reveals something about themselves in moments like these. Fear, strength, patience, selfishness. It all comes to the surface when the ground feels far away." His gaze was steady, but there was a softness in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "What do you think you see in me?" she asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. He tilted his head, considering her question. "I see someone carrying more weight than they need to. Someone who's forgotten how to let go." Sandra's breath caught. She wanted to argue, to dismiss his words as presumptuous, but the truth of them struck too deeply. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the plane gave a sudden lurch, and gasps rippled through the cabin. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, calm but firmer now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence as we descend. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." Sandra snapped into action, her body moving on autopilot as she checked on passengers, her mind racing. But even as she worked, the elderly man's words lingered, cutting through the noise like a steady drumbeat. "Someone who's forgotten how to let go." For the first time, she wondered if he was right. The turbulence hit harder this time, each jolt shaking the cabin with an intensity that silenced every conversation. Overhead, bins rattled ominously, and a sharp clinking of glasses and trays echoed from the galley. Sandra gripped the back of a seat to steady herself, her training keeping her anchored even as her instincts screamed otherwise. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm, a mask she'd perfected over the years. The plane pitched slightly, and a shriek broke through the tense silence. Sandra turned to see a young girl clutching her mother's arm, tears streaming down her face. Sandra moved quickly, crouching beside them despite the plane's unsteady movement. "It's all right," Sandra said, her voice soothing despite the pounding of her pulse. "This is completely normal in turbulence. Think of it like a bumpy road in a car. It feels big, but it's just air doing its job." The girl's sobs quieted slightly, and Sandra offered a reassuring smile to the mother, who mouthed a grateful, "Thank you." Sandra stood, gripping the headrest as another wave of turbulence jolted the plane. As she worked her way back to the galley, Sandra caught sight of row 23. The elderly man was sitting with his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable but calm. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment something passed between them, a silent exchange that felt as grounding as the seat she gripped. He nodded once as if to reassure her, and she nodded back before continuing her checks. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, his tone clipped but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be descending further as we navigate this weather. The crew will remain seated for safety. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelt securely fastened." Sandra returned to the galley, where Molly was pale and gripping the counter like it was her lifeline. "You need to sit," Sandra said firmly, her voice cutting through Molly's panic. I can't," Molly stammered, her wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What if something happens?" Sandra placed her hands on Molly's shoulders, her grip firm but steady. "Molly, listen to me. Nothing's going to happen. The captain knows what he's doing, and so do we. But you have to trust the process. Sit down, buckle in, and focus on breathing. I'll handle the cabin." Molly nodded hesitantly, her movements robotic as she slid into the jump seat and fastened her belt. Sandra gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before stepping back into the aisle. She would stay standing as long as she could, providing a steady presence for the passengers. As the turbulence continued, Sandra noticed something strange about the man in row 23. While other passengers clutched at armrests or whispered prayers, he seemed almost detached, his calmness unnerving in its completeness. His eyes were closed now, his breathing slow and deliberate, as though the chaos around him didn't exist. When the plane pitched again, a loud thud came from further down the cabin, followed by a muffled groan. Sandra moved quickly, her training kicking in. A man had been thrown forward in his seat, his head colliding with the tray table in front of him. Blood trickled from a small gash on his forehead, and his wife was in tears, fumbling with tissues. Sandra crouched beside them, her hands steady despite the turbulence. "Sir, I'm going to check the injury," she said calmly, pulling on a pair of gloves from her pocket. She examined the cut, which was shallow but bleeding steadily. "It's not deep, but we'll need to stop the bleeding." Using a clean gauze pad from the first aid kit, she applied pressure to the wound. "Keep holding this in place," she instructed the man, her voice firm but gentle. "I'll be back to check on you once things settle." As she returned to the galley to fetch more supplies, her thoughts drifted again to the elderly man. She didn't know why he fascinated her, why his calmness felt more significant than the turbulence itself. There was something about him, something unspoken yet undeniable, that kept pulling at her. The plane gave one last violent shudder before finally stabilizing, the turbulence easing into a gentle hum. A collective sigh of relief spread through the cabin as the captain announced they had successfully navigated the worst of the weather. Sandra leaned against the galley counter, her legs weak with exhaustion. Molly looked up at her, her expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You're amazing," Molly said softly. "I don't know how you stayed so calm." Sandra managed a tired smile. "You just do what needs to be done," she replied, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She glanced toward row 23 again, where the elderly man now sat with his eyes open, watching her intently. Something about his gaze unnerved her, not because it was judgmental, but because it wasn't. It was as though he saw more of her than she wanted to reveal, a clarity that made her feel vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt in years. She didn't approach him this time. Instead, she returned to the galley, trying to shake off the weight of his gaze. But deep down, she knew their next encounter was inevitable, and that it would force her to confront truths she wasn't ready to face. The turbulence had subsided, but the cabin's tension lingered. Sandra moved methodically through the aisles, checking on passengers and making sure everyone was secure and unharmed. Most had returned to their normal routines, albeit with a hint of residual unease. The man she had treated earlier was resting, the gauze pad taped neatly to his forehead. His wife nodded gratefully as Sandra passed, her whispered thank you barely audible over the low hum of the engines. Sandra returned to the galley, finally allowing herself a moment to breathe. Her muscles ached from the constant bracing and crouching, and her mind felt like it was running on fumes. "Molly," seated in the jump seat, looked up as Sandra entered. "Are you sure you don't want to sit for a minute?" Molly asked, her voice tentative. Sandra shook her head. "I'm fine," she replied, though the strain in her voice betrayed her exhaustion. She reached for a bottle of water and took a long sip, trying to ignore the growing knot in her chest. The elderly man's words earlier had unsettled her, and now, in the quiet aftermath of the turbulence, they returned with full force. "You've forgotten how to let go." The words felt like an accusation, but also a strange kind of truth she wasn't ready to admit. She had spent so long pushing herself, burying her frustrations and insecurities beneath layers of professionalism, that she wasn't sure what was left beneath. Was she still the person who had fallen in love with this job years ago, or had she become someone else entirely? A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. The call button again, from row 23. Sandra closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply before stepping back into the cabin. She made her way down the aisle, the hum of conversation around her fading as she focused on the man who had become an unwelcome enigma in her day. When she reached his row, he was already looking up at her. His expression calm but with a flicker of something deeper. Concern, perhaps, or curiosity. "Is there something I can assist you with, sir?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes," he said, his tone measured. He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "If you don't mind, I'd like to talk." Sandra hesitated, caught off guard. Passengers rarely requested such direct conversations, and certainly not in the middle of a flight. "I'm not sure this is the best time," she began, her tone edging toward professional deflection. "Take a moment," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "You've earned it." She glanced around the cabin, half expecting a passenger to demand her attention. But the rows were quiet. Most people were absorbed in their own worlds, oblivious to the interaction. Against her better judgment, she nodded and slipped into the seat beside him, her posture rigid as though she were bracing for impact. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. He didn't seem fazed. "I want to know why you're here," he said simply. Sandra frowned. "I'm here because it's my job." "That's not what I mean," he said, his voice steady. "I'm asking why you're really here, why you chose this job in the first place." The question hit her harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment she sat there, staring at him, her mind scrambling to come up with an answer that didn't feel like a lie. "I don't know," she said finally, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. He nodded as though he had expected that answer. "That's what I thought." Sandra bristled, her defenses rising. "What's your point exactly? That I'm in the wrong job? That I'm not good at what I do?" "Not at all," he said calmly. "I think you're very good at what you do. But I also think you've forgotten why you started doing it. And that's a dangerous place to be." His words cut through her like a blade, sharp and unyielding. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, she knew he wasn't. She thought back to her early days on the job, when every flight had felt like an adventure, when the challenges had seemed like opportunities rather than burdens. Somewhere along the way, that spark had dimmed, replaced by exhaustion and a growing sense of resentment she didn't want to acknowledge. "I don't have the luxury of idealism," she said finally, her voice bitter. "This job pays the bills. It's not about passion, it's about survival." "And yet," he said, leaning slightly forward, "you're still here, still giving more of yourself than you realize. If it were just about survival, you wouldn't care so much." Sandra stared at him, her chest tightening. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he didn't know her life or her struggles. But she couldn't. His words had struck a chord too deep to ignore. "Who are you?" she asked suddenly, her voice quieter now. "Why do you care so much about what I'm doing with my life?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried a weight she couldn't quite place. "I've seen people like you before," he said. "People who lose themselves in the work, who forget to take a step back and remember what they're working toward. I care because I've been where you are, and I know how easy it is to stay lost." Sandra didn't know how to respond. For the first time in years, she felt exposed, as though someone had peeled back the layers she had built around herself and seen the parts she tried to keep hidden. She looked away, her throat tight. The intercom buzzed, breaking the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "we'll be beginning our final descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all carry-on items are stowed." Sandra stood abruptly, smoothing her uniform. "I should get back to work," she said, her voice clipped. The man nodded but said nothing as she walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. Back in the galley, Sandra leaned against the counter, her hands shaking slightly. She didn't understand why his words affected her so deeply, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Whatever this man had stirred in her, it wouldn't be silenced easily. The plane began its descent, the steady hum of the engines shifting to a softer, lower tone. Sandra moved through the cabin with mechanical precision, ensuring that passengers were securely buckled in and their belongings properly stowed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a calm, muted glow over the rows. Despite her outward composure, her thoughts churned in a relentless loop, circling back to her conversation with the elderly man in row 23. "Why are you really here?" His question gnawed at her, forcing her to confront feelings she had buried under years of routine and necessity. She had entered the airline industry with dreams of adventure, of seeing the world and connecting with people. But somewhere along the way, the job had become just that, a job. The spark she once felt had been replaced by exhaustion and a growing sense of disillusionment. She wondered if he had sensed all of that in her, or if she had simply let too much of herself slip through her carefully constructed mask. As Sandra passed row 23 again, she felt his eyes on her. He wasn't reading or staring out the window this time. He was watching her, his expression unreadable but somehow softer than before. She avoided meeting his gaze, focusing instead on the tasks at hand. But the weight of his presence lingered, a reminder of the questions she wasn't ready to answer. The descent grew more pronounced, and the plane shuddered lightly as it passed through a patch of light turbulence. Passengers held their armrests or glanced anxiously at the crew, their reactions a mix of instinctive fear and trust in the unseen forces guiding them safely to the ground. Sandra moved to her jump seat, fastening her harness with quick, practiced movements. Molly sat across from her, her face still pale but her breathing more even now. "You okay?" Molly asked hesitantly, her voice barely audible over the cabin noise. Sandra nodded, though her mind was far from settled. "Just a long day," she said, her tone clipped. Molly didn't press further, and the two sat in silence as the plane descended through a thick layer of clouds. The wheels touched down with a smooth, almost imperceptible jolt. A ripple of applause broke out among the passengers, as often happened on turbulent flights. Sandra allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. Regardless of how she felt, this part of the job always gave her a sense of accomplishment. The knowledge that she had helped guide people through their fear and brought them safely to their destination. As the plane taxied to the gate, Sandra rose from her seat and began preparing for deplaning. She moved quickly, her motions efficient as she opened overhead bins and assisted passengers with their luggage. The cabin buzzed with the familiar sounds of post-flight activity, seatbelt buckles clicking open, bags being hoisted down, and passengers murmuring to one another about connecting flights and final destinations. When she reached row 23, the elderly man was still seated, his briefcase resting neatly on his lap. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, his movements deliberate as he rose to his feet. Sandra offered a polite smile, her mask firmly back in place. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her tone professional. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "for everything." Sandra frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. But before she could ask, he turned and made his way down the aisle, his movements unhurried despite the crowd bustling around him. She watched him go, a strange mix of relief and curiosity swirling in her chest. Part of her wanted to follow him, to ask him what he had seen in her and why he seemed so intent on pulling back the layers she had worked so hard to protect. But another part of her, The part that was tired and afraid of what she might find held her back. When the last passenger had deplaned, Sandra walked slowly down the empty cabin, inspecting the seats and overhead bins for any forgotten items. Her thoughts drifted to the elderly man again, to the calm certainty in his voice and the way his words seemed to echo long after he was gone. As she reached row 23, she noticed something on the seat. A folded piece of paper rested where he had been sitting, its edges slightly worn as though it had been handled many times. She picked it up, her heart pounding as she unfolded it. The note was short, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "Don't lose yourself in the work. Remember why you started." Sandra stared at the words, her chest tightening. She looked around the empty cabin, as though expecting to see him standing there, watching her. But he was gone, leaving only the note and the questions it stirred within her. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. As she stood there, the faint hum of the engines fading into silence, she realized that this wasn't just about a passenger or a single flight. It was about something much larger, something she would have to face sooner or later. For now, though, she straightened her uniform, squared her shoulders, and returned to the galley. There were still duties to complete, still passengers to serve, still flights to prepare for. But as she moved through the familiar motions, she felt something shift inside her. A small, quiet spark she hadn't felt in years. And though she didn't fully understand it yet, she knew it was the beginning of something she couldn't ignore. The passengers had long since cleared the jet bridge, and the cabin was eerily quiet. Sandra stood in the galley, staring out at the empty rows of seats. The folded note in her pocket felt heavier than it should have, its words still pressing against her mind. She had read them twice more since the last passenger disembarked, as if hoping they might reveal something she hadn't yet grasped. But the meaning was simple and undeniable. Don't lose yourself in the work. Remember why you started. The sentence wasn't just advice, it was a mirror, forcing her to confront the person she had become and the reasons she had buried along the way. Sandra wasn't sure she liked what she saw. Molly's voice broke through her thoughts, soft and hesitant. "Hey, Sandra, are you okay?" Sandra turned to find the younger woman watching her, concern etched across her face. Molly had taken off her scarf and loosened the bun in her hair, her posture more relaxed now that the flight was over. Sandra nodded, though the gesture felt automatic, disconnected from the storm inside her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. Molly tilted her head, unconvinced. "You've been quiet since we landed. Was it that man in 23C? He seemed different." Sandra's gaze flicked toward row 23, the seat now just a shadowed outline in the dim cabin light. "He wasn't like most passengers," she admitted, "but I'm not sure that's a bad thing." Molly raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What did he say to you?" Sandra hesitated, the memory of their conversation swirling in her mind. She wasn't ready to explain, not to Molly, not to anyone. What he had said felt deeply personal, a challenge she needed to face alone. "Nothing important," Sandra said finally, her voice softer now. "Just things to think about." Molly didn't press further, sensing the weight of Sandra's thoughts. Instead, she offered a small smile. "Well, if you need to talk, I'm here. You've been carrying the team a lot lately. Maybe it's time to let someone carry you for a change." Sandra blinked, surprised by the words. They echoed the sentiment of the note in her pocket, and for a moment she wondered if the universe, or the man in row 23, had conspired to send her this message in as many forms as possible. "Thanks, Molly," she said, her voice steadier now. "I appreciate that." The two women worked quietly to finish their post-flight duties, their movements synchronized and efficient. When they finally stepped off the plane, the terminal was nearly empty, the bustle of earlier replaced by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Sandra walked with Molly to the crew room, where they handed in their final reports and collected their belongings. As they parted ways, Molly gave her a small wave. "Get some rest, okay?" Sandra nodded, managing a faint smile. "You too." Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. a welcome contrast to the stale cabin air she had been breathing for hours. She walked to her car slowly, her thoughts still tangled but quieter now. As she slid into the driver's seat, she pulled the note from her pocket and read it one more time. Don't lose yourself in the work. Remember why you started. She thought back to the beginning, to the young woman who had applied for her first job as a flight attendant, with stars in her eyes and dreams of adventure in her heart. That woman had been full of hope, ready to take on the world and make connections with the people she met along the way. Somewhere along the journey, that hope had dimmed, replaced by fatigue and frustration. But maybe it wasn't too late to find it again. Sandra tucked the note carefully into the glove compartment and started the engine. As she drove through the quiet streets, she resolved to take the man's words to heart, not just as advice, but as a challenge. It wouldn't be easy to rediscover what she had lost, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of determination. The man in row 23 had left more than a note. He had left a question, one she knew she would carry with her until she found the answer. And as the city lights blurred past her window, Sandra allowed herself to believe that the answer was still within her reach. Sometimes life has a way of humbling us when we least expect it. In a moment of frustration, one decision can change everything. For the flight attendant, her impulsive actions not only exposed her hidden biases, but also forced her to confront the deeper truths about respect, humility, and kindness. What she didn't realize was that the man she disrespected was not just wealthy or powerful. He was someone who valued the dignity of every human being, regardless of their status or appearance. His forgiveness became her greatest lesson, that how we treat others, especially in moments of stress, reflects who we are at our core. This story reminds us all of the importance of empathy, patience, and respect, qualities that cost nothing but mean everything. It's a lesson to pause, reflect, and think before we act, because we never truly know someone's story or the weight they carry. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we invite you to join us. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that resonate with the heart and challenge the mind. Let's keep learning, growing, and spreading the lessons that truly matter together.